All right, welcome everybody and good evening. Thank you all so much for making the time to attend this webinar today. My name is Aarti Halbe. I work with the Consensus Building Institute and I'm part of the team that's working on the Muddy River Visioning Project. We're really happy to have you here. Next slide, please. Just a quick introduction and what we'll be talking pretty extensively about the Muddy River history, the current conditions, kind of some of the options that we're looking at for the future of the river today. This is not a formal webinar, this is a meeting, so please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know your name, your pronouns, your affiliation, what brought you here, what interested you about the Muddy. We will have time at the end of, in the last 15 minutes for questions. So we'll ask you all to stay muted until then, and feel free to use the chat to drop in questions or comments as the presentation goes on. And you can also, when we get to the discussion point, use the raise hand function to raise your hand digitally as we go. And with that, I will hand it over to Emily.
Aarti, thank you so much. And it's so wonderful to see so many familiar names here. So thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Emily Norton. I'm the Executive Director of Charles River Watershed Association and super excited to have you all here. So first, always want to start out with recognition and respect for the Indigenous people who've lived in these lands for many, many generations, and we acknowledge the tribes that we're aware of, the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and the Nipmuc nations as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land and water. Quick background about CRWA. We were founded in 1965 by a group of residents who did not accept the conventional wisdom at the time that the Charles River could not be cleaned up. We've obviously made incredible progress since that time, but the work is not done, which is what we're here about tonight is a very important segment of it. We have 5 important or key program areas, and this one sort of falls within our river restoration bucket of work. And just some quick background about watersheds. Probably people here are well aware, but what is a watershed? A watershed is something that when the rain falls, wherever that water ends up in, whatever water body, whatever river that ends up in, that's your watershed. So this is a map of the Charles River watershed. The river starts in Hopkinton and winds its way north to Boston. 35 cities and towns in the watershed. And it's really important to take a watershed view because what happens upstream affects communities downstream, particularly as we are in the climate change era. And what are we going to accomplish tonight? So we're going to go over what our objectives are with working with you to create this vision plan for the Muddy River watershed. Quick history about how we got here in terms of the Muddy, current conditions as we've ascertained them, and what some future possibilities are, and then next steps from there. So, vision, plan, objectives. What do we mean by that? Context. A lot of folks were reaching out to us during the summer. Hey, if Paris can make the Seine swimmable for the Olympics, why can't the Charles be clean enough for swimming? And granted, devil's in the details, the Seine wasn't 100% clean all the time, as we know. But the overall vision and the overall goal remains the same ever since the 1972 Clean Water Act, having as a goal fishable, swimmable rivers by 1983. We're not quite there yet. And then the 1995 Clean Charles Initiative out of the regional US EPA, promising a swimmable Charles by 2005. Again, we have not hit that goal. We have not given up that goal, and we don't believe any of you have either. We simply cannot have a swimmable Charles in the lower basin if we do not address the pollution in the Muddy River. As folks probably have heard, this is the most polluted tributary that we test, and we're going to be getting into some of that tonight. So the elements of the vision plan, we are not here to say, this is what we think we should be doing, and we want you all to agree to it. What we do want to do is bring some principles to it and bring you along on this journey. And so that as you see things that are provided and offered up as potential paths forward, you can help us by joining in or tweaking it or kicking the tires and say, you know what, I don't really like that, but what about this instead? We do have some principles as part of that work, though. So we take what's called a sub-watershed view, which is similar to looking at the whole watershed. And you'll be hearing more about this. What happens upstream in the sub-watershed affects the area downstream. We do think it's important to really center nature-based solutions. So you're going to be hearing a bit about that. We definitely care a lot about water quality. It's hard to have a healthy river system if you're not looking at the water quality. And we absolutely want to be taking climate change into account. And then, as I started out with, this is very much community driven. We are not just telling you the way we think it should be. We are offering up the science, the data, the future in terms of climate change, and then need you to be a part of the solution going forward. The project team consists of 3 organizations: Charles River Watershed Association. And on this webinar, you've got myself, Lisa Kumpf, Max Rome, Amber Siegel, and Amelia Dick Fiora del Fabro. We are doing technical analyses and part of the community engagement team. Emerald Necklace Conservancy, we are so thrilled to be partnering with the Conservancy, and particularly ED Karen Monty Brodak and Jack Schleifer. You probably have worked with them already in many ways and certainly have experienced the Emerald Necklace, but public partnership angle, the land stewardship angle, and a community engagement, which we are all engaged with. And then we're really happy to have CBI as our stakeholder engagement experts: Patrick Field, Elizabeth Cooper, and Artie Halby, who you heard from earlier, particularly on making sure that we are really engaging the community as effectively as possible. And we are also thrilled to have so many partners from governmental agencies, nonprofits. This list is growing. If you know of a group or entity, or individual who you think should and would be interested, please let us know. We want to be as inclusive as possible, but we are so excited to have the folks who are listed here already on board and engaged. In terms of the timeline, folks who've been involved so far know that we've been having in-person meetings, webinars along the way. And so where we are here is sort of the more expanded stakeholder outreach. Want to make sure that folks who maybe didn't have a chance to hear the initial presentations last year have a chance to get caught up now as we move through this two-year plan. As you can see, the plan is to be complete in March with a final vision plan that people have had a chance to be engaged and excited about, and ideally help us then lobby to implement. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jack.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Emily. And thank you all so much for being here and taking some time out of your Tuesday night to talk about the Muddy River and the watershed and how we can think about its improvements. Also, if we go to the next slide. So as was said before, my name is Jack Schleifer. I'm the field operations manager with the Emerald Necklace Conservancy, which means I have the privilege of being out in the parks most days, looking at the current conditions and working on the landscape restoration and other similar projects, often focused on tree care. And I've also had the privilege of learning a lot about the history of this park system and the history of the Back Bay Fens, which are pictured right here, but the whole Emerald Necklace. So I'm going to be talking about that for a handful of slides. I'm sure many of you know a lot of this, but I still think it's an important piece in orienting us in the current conditions. So the Emerald Necklace and the Muddy River in particular was originally a tidal channel that was estuarial and flowed in and out. And there was many challenges that came with that, but the land was long stewarded by folks, before colonial times. So thank you to Emily for mentioning the indigenous communities that have held this land. We go to the next slide. As colonization expanded and as development continued in Boston, there are many challenges that came with the tidal nature of the Muddy River. So in the late 1850s, late 1800s, it was a tidal estuary, is also a raw sewage dump, and there were a lot of challenges with how stinky it was, how unstable the land was. So a lot of the land was backfilled and kind of turned towards what we now understand. And then in the later 1800s, Frederick Law Olmsted came along and further shaped this landscape into the park system that we now see today. Although there have been some eras of redesign since then, he's the kind of person most credited with shaping the system into how we see it right now. we go to the next slide, this shows a few pictures of those conditions in the late 1800s. And it, in some ways, very much resembles what we see today. Of course, we've had changes and we're working with different species compositions and a very different scale of urbanization. But it's nice to be able to reference a lot of the historic designs and historic images that show how this park system was first intended to look in Olmsted's era. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that this system then for a while kind of fell into an era of um, arguable negligence or kind of lacking maintenance. And in the late 1900s, about 100 years after its creation, there was record rainfall. Some of us might remember all of it. And it caused a whole bunch of flooding throughout the city. And when the system was designed, its intention was to be a stormwater management system for Boston and Brookline and the whole watershed, which includes Newton and other folks as well. But this work hadn't necessarily been kept up on, hadn't been maintained, and this year posed a huge challenge. So the Kenmore T station flooded, the first floor of the MFA flooded, and this is kind of the Conservancy's origin story because we were established to work within the system and help steward it to ensure that this wouldn't happen again. So at this time, this kind of kicked off and catalyzed what was called the Muddy River Restoration Project. So if we go to the next slide, that is a project I'm sure many of you know quite intimately because it's been ongoing for the past 20 some odd years. And it had the goals listed here of reducing the flood damage potential of the system, improving the water quality, also looking towards aquatic and riparian habitat, as well as landscape features, and doing this all under the guide of the best management practices for implementation. And a lot of this concluded, if we go to the next slide, in 2023. So this shows the whole timeline, kind of starting with those floods and the conception of the project in the late 90s. And then, of course, a whole bunch of permitting and paperwork that was necessary before there could be approvals sought. And then the construction really began in 2013 and concluded with its second phase of work in 2023. So we're at a really interesting point right now to be able to look back at this project and evaluate how effective it was and make sure that we're still oriented towards the future and thinking about what improvements we can build on all this work that's been done. So if we go to the next slide, it says that it was built into two different phases. In the first phase, we're focused on restoring Lift Park, which was once a parking lot. I think we have a picture of that coming up, into what's now a park space, which is beautiful and poses a whole bunch of challenges for environmental managers like myself. But it's a real win from an environmental restoration perspective. And this shows a whole bunch of other restoration activities that took place throughout the Emerald Necklace. And there's a whole range from dredging to planting to replacing culverts and bridges and removing invasive plants, which I can attest is something that we're still trying to do every day. But there's a lot of work that went into this project. And I'd like to emphasize that although these are all amazing changes, they all happened directly within the Emerald Necklace. And I think it's important as we move into this project to think about how we can expand our scale and look at the system from the watershed view and think about what solutions might exist both in the necklace but also outside of the necklace to help improve the water and the conditions that are coming into our muddy river. So we go to the next slide. I think we can see some of the successes of this project. I love this slide because it shows I was actually just around here today doing some work, and this area had been turned to a parking lot when that's what we did, and we were urbanizing and we love to pave. But thanks to many environmental leaders since then, we've been able to turn it. I can't say we, I was not a part of that. Folks have been able to restore it into parkland. And the Muddy River, although it's not visible in this picture on the left, it was still there. It was just in culverts beneath all the pavement. So to be able to daylight it and restore it in this way is, I think, really inspiring. And I personally love being able to go there and see a whole bunch of things growing and swimming and flying. If we go to the next slide, it kind of summarizes the numbers of this project. And I don't want to move through it too quickly, but I do want to keep us moving along. But there were $70 million spent across a few different entities on this project, which resulted in 40 acres of habitat restored, over 990,000, cubic yards of sediment removed, 460 trees planted, which we're still watering and trying to nurture today to make sure they become the big trees that we want them to be, in addition to 19,000 plugs of various plants and wetland plants in particular. And this was done by the Army Corps of Engineers, but in conjunction with the leadership of Boston, Brookline, DCR, and then a whole bunch of community members like yourselves. So if we go to the next slide. As I said, it's a really interesting time for us to be reflecting on the success of the project and some of the shortcomings, perhaps, but looking at that honestly so that we can move forwards in our stewardship. And the project really sought to, reduce the flood damage potential of the river and increase the stormwater conveyance. And it seems to have done that quite effectively. It also mentioned water quality improvement and all these things that I mentioned below. And I think we're at a point where the water quality improvement standards that the community would love to see were not all necessarily attained through this project. So that's why I'm grateful to be working on this with the CRWA and sitting in spaces with folks like you all, so we can do that and make sure we're following our best management practices and everything else. So I will pass it over to Amber and Lisa with that, but I'll also throw my email in the chat. So if we can go to the next slide, if people have any other questions or comments, we can talk about them. I'm happy to be here through the rest of the call, and also happy to talk over email at any point. So thanks again.
All right, thanks, Jack, and hi, everyone. My name is Amber Siegel, and I'm the River Restoration Project Manager at CRWA. So we're going to get into existing conditions of the Muddy River, but first I'm just going to get into a few basics to ensure that we all understand what's going on and what we hope to achieve in the Muddy River subwatershed. So next slide. So as Emily mentioned, we're taking a subwatershed-wide view, and to reiterate what that means, a watershed is the total area of land that drains into a body of water. So in this case, it would be the geographic area that drains into the Muddy River. And then subwatersheds are a section of the larger watershed. So for example, the Muddy River subwatershed makes up a part of the larger Charles River watershed, or in this case, 2% of the Charles River watershed. So next slide. So specifically, the Muddy River watershed spans 4 jurisdictions, which includes Brookline, Newton, several Boston neighborhoods, as well as DCR-owned land. And 60% of the subwatershed sits within Brookline, and 53% of Brookline is within the subwatershed, meaning that Brookline is really quite a crucial part of the Muddy River subwatershed and the work that we're seeking to do. So the takeaway there is just water quality in the Muddy depends on the activities in the entirety of its watershed, because all of that water is again flowing into the Muddy River. So next slide. So our key takeaway number 1 then is rivers are watersheds. The Muddy River is not just a river, it's an interconnected watershed, and we really have to pay attention to everything that is going on throughout the entirety of the watershed, which here includes Boston, Brookline, and Newton, amongst others. The next slide. Now we're going to get a little bit into the technical elements of what's going on. So impervious surfaces. As we know, developed land alters water flow. Undeveloped landscape, where you have grassy, vegetated areas, as on the left, tends to absorb water better. We have more infiltration and less runoff. Comparatively, on the right, where you see the developed landscape, we have more impervious areas, so think paved, parking lots, or roadways, and these surfaces are less able to absorb water, which contributes to greater amounts of runoff and less infiltration. This runoff can be problematic for the health of our waterways, as well as the well-being of our communities. So next slide. So storm water runoff, and what we might consider wet weather pollution, occurs when heavy rain events, and thus stormwater picks up pollution from our highways, parking lots, and roads, and carries them straight into our river. And that will degrade the river, the ecosystem, and further threaten our public health. So next slide. A common issue we see with wet weather pollution is the existence of combined sewer overflows. And we do have that in the Muddy River, and we'll get into the specifics of that in a little bit. But just to highlight what that means is, in the Muddy River, we have a combined system. So that means when water flow is high, as on the left, you see the 2 flows of water coming in, the water from the sewage and the stormwater combines, overwhelming the pipe and flowing into the Charles River. When there's less rainwater, it is able to flow towards the treatment plant instead, but in heavy rain events, this is not the case, and again, it flows into the Charles River. We also have things called separated systems, in which the sewer pipes and the stormwater drains are entirely separate. So regardless of the rain events, it remains separate. There are also several of these in the Muddy River and the Charles River watershed as well, but we also have the existence of combined systems, which of course threatens the water quality of our river. Next slide. And then a bit about dry weather pollution. So this would be pollution that we would see in dry weather, regardless of storm events. And on the right, you'll see a diagram of this, but the first is illegal direct connections or illicit connections. And it's where wastewater or sewer pipes from a building has been unlawfully connected to stormwater drainage pipes. This can occur when the building is older, but we also see it in newer buildings as well. And again, it's draining right into the river, so this is threatening and damaging our water quality as well as public health. We also see this as a result of leaky pipes, and you'll see that in the diagram as well. This can also be due to older broken infrastructure, but in this case, then wastewater seeps out and leaks directly into the stormwater drainage pipes and then into the Muddy River. So both the illicit connections and the leaky pipes, which can occur during dry weather events, are negatively impacting the Muddy River as well. Slide. And now I'm going to hand it off to Lisa, who's going to speak a little more specifically about these issues in the Muddy River and its subwatershed.
Thanks so much, Amber. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Kumpf, and I am the River Restoration Program Manager at Charles River Watershed Association. So I think Amber set it up nicely, and then we're going to kind of focus on each of these issues as they exist in the Muddy River subwatershed. So this map is showing all of those grayed areas are the impervious surfaces, so roofs and roads throughout the Muddy River watershed. And by calculation, 44% of this watershed land is impervious, which is a pretty high number. It's not as high as some really dense neighborhoods in Boston. You can kind of see some of the denser areas are like by the Longwood area. And there's some less dense areas kind of in the South Brookline area. But on average, 44% is impervious. So that means we definitely do have these stormwater runoff issues. There are over 20 different outfalls that drain directly into the river. And there are kind of 4 major subbasins that we think are contributing a lot of runoff into this area. And you can see on this diagram those subbasins. One is the biggest major one is Village Brook, which is dotted here and starts all the way up in the Chestnut Hill Reservoir area. And then there's also a south branch of the Village Brook that starts down in South Brookline and then comes up by Brookline Reservoir and meets up underground with the main branch of Village Brook, which then drains out into Leverett Pond. North of that is Tannery Brook, which is again, an underground stream essentially. This was something that used to be above ground and was put underground during development to make more room for building and infrastructure, and is now essentially a large pipe underground. North of that, there's also a fairly large drain that comes out near Longwood Avenue, and there's a kind of significant area coming from Boston near the Daisy Field area. So these are some of the key places that we're looking, but of course we know this is a watershed-wide problem. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a zoom in here to really try to visualize that underground network of pipes that exists under all of our feet every day. And this is a zoomed in version of Brookline's pipe network. All of the bright blue dots that you see are manholes. Those open dots are storm drains that you see on the street. And then all of those blue lines are these major pipes and trunk lines. And this one in particular, this light blue drainage area is the Village Brook drainage area, the very end of it, where it then has an outfall out into the northern part of Leverett Pond. So really just stressing here that all of the water, pretty much everything coming into the Muddy River is through these pipes. which are essentially underground streams. And, you know, with a kind of back of the envelope calculation, more than 50% of the water coming in to the system in the Muddy River is coming through that Village Brook system, the South Branch and the main branch of Village Brook, which is quite significant. So these pipes are really carrying a large volume of water, and all of that water is stormwater runoff that's picking up pollutants along the streets as it comes down. And there is a lot of area where you can see, if you're thinking about the underground pipe network, the potential for these illicit connections and leaky pipes that Amber talked about. Next slide. So we looked at some of the data that CRWA and other groups have collected over many years. All of this data that's displayed on this bar chart here comes from 30 years of monthly sampling for bacteria at a downstream point in the Muddy River in the Charles Gate area. So each of those red and blue dots that you see are a data point, and what we've done here is separated it by whether that water sample was collected in dry weather, which is the red dots, or wet weather, which is the blue dots. And then we've kind of made this box around them to say, okay, where are most of these in relation to that E. coli level or that pollution level? So the big thick line in the middle there is the average of the dry and wet samples. And then that dotted line is the swimming standard in Massachusetts. So you can see here that both the averages for both dry and wet weather samples are falling above that swimming standard in Massachusetts. And that indicates that we have two different things. We have both wet weather pollution, which is coming from a stormwater source, and dry weather pollution that's coming from the illicit connections, illicit discharge sources that Amber explained. Next slide. And I wouldn't be without mentioning a CSO that we do have in the Muddy River as well. Now, this CSO is actually a little more complicated than your typical CSO in the Boston area, because the Muddy River used to be a tidal channel. Another tidal channel network that was right next to the Muddy River was the Stony Brook tidal channel. And when the Emerald Necklace was formed, it was decided that the whole Stony Brook system would actually be undergrounded. And so what you're seeing here on the left is a map, and all of those red lines are the underground parts of the stream. So you can see the Muddy River watershed and the Stony Brook watershed. And then there is one location right where those meet up, right before they go into the Charles, up near the Back Bay Fens, where there is this CSO point where in very high precipitation storms, this CSO does discharge over into the Muddy River, but it's actually coming from the Stony Brook watershed rather than the Muddy River watershed. So we don't actually have combined pipes in the Muddy River watershed. We only have them in the I'm not sure about that, but basically there's an overflow for the Stony Brook watershed to go directly into the Muddy River during those high flows. So while this is an issue, it's not probably the central amount of, it's probably not the most amount of pollution that's coming into the Muddy River from its watershed. And CRWA has a separate campaign called our Cut the Crap campaign, focusing on CSO discharges and eliminating those, which includes this one. Next slide. So then I wanted to just show this pollution over time graph. So this is showing our Charles River report card grades, and these ones are actually just for the Muddy River, that 30-year data set that I used earlier as well. But looking over time, you can see that these are extremely low grades, ranging from D- to C+, whereas most of the Charles River watershed is in like the B+ to A- range. And you can see that there's really not been an improving trend since 2002. So it kind of shows you that whatever we're doing and the improvements that we have made, they're great, but they're not enough. They're not doing enough to improve water quality. Next slide. So this comes to takeaway question number 2. We really need to address these urban drainage challenges, including stormwater runoff and illicit discharges, that wet weather and dry weather pollution, in order to focus on the water quality of the Muddy River. Next slide. Awesome. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Max Rome.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I'm seeing so many great questions in the chat, and I'm getting distracted, but I'm going to ignore them for later. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, where do we go from here? What can we do? So click on to that next slide. Just to reiterate, the way CRWA likes to approach these water quality challenges is to really think about nature-based solutions. How can we clean up the river? How can we clean up the inputs into the river? Using nature, letting plants and letting the landscape do the work as much as possible. That's not always possible, but that's kind of where we like to start and how we try and prioritize some of our suggestions. Next slide. I think it's important to kind of picture, where is it that we can come in and make improvements. And I think a useful way to think about it is to imagine the drainage system and to consider that we can make interventions before the pipe. We can make interventions that help us get water into the ground, get water flowing through planted systems before it ends up in the stormwater network. We can also make interventions within the pipe network. So this is what we might call in-pipe solutions. These solutions are going to tend to be much more engineered. There's less opportunity to kind of work with nature and do nature-based design, but it's something that we've got to consider. And then finally, kind of end-of-pipe solution, we're also looking at solutions that are, correcting these sources of pollution, mitigating these sources of pollution, as they enter the natural environment. So kind of how can we enhance the Muddy River's own capacity for self-purification? How can we, help to fulfill this kind of Olmstedian vision of a working landscape that's, not only scenic and provides habitat, but that's also kind of processing the nutrient and pollutant load from the city in a way that's healthful. Next slide. So before the pipe, this is where we really have an opportunity to use green infrastructure. These are improvements that can be made to the streetscape of the city using techniques like biofiltration, tree trenches, rain gardens, permeable pavers, anything that we do to decrease impervious area, ahead of the pipes and increase the amount of greenery and increase opportunities for water to get into the ground. That's what we're talking about when we talk about before pipe solutions. These solutions are going to have a major positive impact on wet weather pollution. They can also really have some benefits for the community, for neighborhood, but they're not going to have a big impact on the kind of dry weather pollution that Lisa was highlighting. Next slide. In-pipe solutions. This is a little bit of an emerging field in stormwater, or kind of an emerging application in stormwater. As we attempt to reach our Clean Water Act goals, fishable, swimmable river, there are situations in which we realize that, stormwater flows are very complicated and are very polluted. And there are situations in which we need to treat stormwater a little bit like we would treat wastewater. And that means using, a very engineered system that might include pretreatment. It might include a media filter, some kind of proprietary treatment system, and it might even include something like UV disinfection. These would be systems that would be sized to deal with, not the surging flows that would be associated with a big storm, but systems that would be sized to deal with that kind of contaminated base flow, that kind of average median background flow that is, really driving that poor water quality during dry weather conditions. And this is, I think this is a bit at the frontier of what's being done now, but there are examples, even in Massachusetts, where this is an approach that's being taken to contaminate stormwater. Next slide. End of pipe. CRWA led, I think, a pretty terrific walk through the alewife constructed wetland this summer. This is a real jewel in our region in terms of showcasing a system that is treating water, but is also habitat, and is also an incredible public amenity. This is essentially a stormwater wetland that resulted from the separation of 400 acres of combined sewer area in Cambridge. And it, not only does it kind of provide storage to equalize heavy storms and prevent flooding, but it also is designed to really sequentially provide water quality treatment, from a sedimentation basin that lets kind of particles and debris settle out of the water to a series of, biofiltration trenches and planted pools where there's the opportunity for, the natural attenuation of bacterial contamination before that clean water is released into the Alewife Brook. Next slide. In addition to thinking about, where can we make interventions, I think it's also useful to think about, where in our regulatory system is there, pressure, incentive, a framework to make these changes. One of the really big permits that's governing this work is the municipal stormwater permit system, which is also called MS4. And, this places, somewhat major requirements on the cities of, Boston, Newton, and Brookline to clean up their stormwater and to find, up to 50, or in the case of Boston, even 60% reductions in stormwater pollution into the Charles River and also into the Muddy River. The MS4 permit is kind of mostly framed around phosphorus and nutrient pollution, but doing this work to get stormwater into the ground instead of right into these stormwater pipes is also going to have a really positive effect on bacterial pollution in the Muddy River. So, there's a lot that can be done to align those MS4 goals with the work that we really want to see happening in the Muddy River watershed specifically. And I'll say that the MS4 permit includes certain requirements for the cities of Brookline and Boston to go through and do regular monitoring to look for illicit discharges, figure out where they're coming, and design corrective actions. And we've got Maria Rose on the call today, who kind of oversees that program for Brookline. Amy Schofield and Jay Hersey from Brookline, Amy from Boston, were able to join us for our last call and kind of gave a bit of an overview of all of the work that they do to tackle this really challenging problem. But, this is, I just want to be clear, this is not the case that Boston and Brookline aren't doing anything. They're working really hard to kind of address this source of contamination. And then finally, something new that's coming is This fall, EPA is expected to release specifics on something called the Residual Designation Authority, which basically means that all properties that are greater than 1 acre, have greater than 1 acre of impervious area, are going to be required to do more to manage stormwater on their property. So all of this is just to say there are major initiatives that are going to drive improvements regionally. And if we can do some good planning, we can harness those regulations to really see some improvements in the Muddy River watershed. Next slide. In addition to these ongoing regulations, there are some big and meaningful projects that are going to be happening in the Muddy, on this kind of 5-year horizon. There's dredging that's in permitting for Willow Pond. BWSC is in kind of a pretty advanced design phase with some infrastructure improvements to the Daisy Field drainage system that will really do a lot to reduce sedimentation into Leverett Pond and bacterial contamination into Leverett Pond. DCR is in the midst of a comprehensive rehabilitation of their many, many outfalls, stormwater outfalls that drain into the Muddy. And then, finally, there's a major revitalization plan for the entire Charles Gate area, which includes a realignment of Sturrow Drive and, a daylighting of the connection between the Muddy River and the Charles River. And that is, really supposed to be happening, kicking off in 2028. And that's going to be a huge project that's going to really increase the amount of flushing and out of the Muddy River and the amount of interchange between the Muddy and the Charles River. That should have very positive water quality impacts for the Muddy River. Next slide. So to kind of bring this all home, this is a big project. This is a major undertaking that we're talking about. But we can do big things. This is a big project and it's worth investing in. It's worth really thinking about. It's worth really coming up with a vision about. This is an opportunity to, not just secure kind of a climate resilient future for the Muddy River and deal with flooding, but to really secure a biodiverse and ecologically vibrant corridor, in the center of Boston, right here in Boston and Brookline. And just, I think, all of us at the Charles River Watershed Association, we spend a lot of time, often on the main stem of the Charles River, which in places looks really great. But, when you get out on the Muddy, especially if you're able to get out on a boat in the Muddy River, you're going to smell sewage. You're going to see toilet paper that's kind of hanging from low branches in the brook. You're going to see places where the brook looks one color and the water coming in from the Tannery Brook outfall looks a completely different color. The Muddy is today where the Charles River was in 1995, and with really good work, the Charles River went from a D to an A-, and that's what we need to do in the Muddy. So, I know, the people in this room, the people in this conversation now are the ones who can really make that difference. Next slide. So, the final takeaway for this presentation is, how do we get there? Action takes a collective vision and advocacy. So, CRWA, we are here to, be part of this movement, but it's going to take consensus. There's so many different pieces of this puzzle. And we're, really trying to just, work in collaboration with all of you who care about the Muddy River to really reimagine what this, jewel of the Boston Park system, should look like, could look like, and to chart a path to get there.
Thank you, Max.
Yeah.
And just before we kind of open it up for questions, I'd just love to talk you through a couple of next steps as we see them. Next slide, please. So just to recap, we started this process almost a year ago. We had our first public meeting last November in the Fenway. And CRWA has done a ton of hard work over the last many months to establish existing conditions. They're working on finalizing that existing conditions report. And we've been doing a lot of stakeholder outreach. And like Max said, we can't do this alone. This is something that really requires feedback and input and a lot of like brain power from a lot of different people. So we're really excited that you're here tonight. In the next few months, we're going to be doing some focus groups. We're going to have a public charrette probably in January or February, and we will have a final plan by March of 2025. Next slide, please. There's a few ways that you can learn more and get involved. If you haven't heard it already, we made a little podcast about the Muddy recently. And we'd love for you to listen to it and share it with anyone you know. We'll pop all these links in the chat. But the two other things I wanted to note is that there are opportunities to volunteer with the Emerald Necklace. So we have a sign-up page. And also CRWA will be running a couple of walks along the Muddy later this month. So on Friday the 18th and on Sunday the 27th. I believe these aren't yet on the CRWA website, but they will be very soon. So we'll throw that link up as well. And we hope you can come out and join us. Next slide, please. And finally, let's talk. What questions do you have about any of the information we've shared today? What has excited you? And especially, how would you like to be involved? We're really excited to hear all of your feedback. We have about 10 minutes. Feel free to put questions in the chat. You're welcome to raise your hand and come off mute to ask. But the floor is open. Tony, go ahead.
Hey, I have a question about how soon we're going to hear more about what the options for nature-based solutions, because although that was emphasized as your priority, we didn't get specific senses of how those could work in the context of the Muddy River, where there's so much little space. And so hearing more about what those nature-based solutions, which might create interesting effects on the landscape around it, would be wonderful. One other much more detailed question I have is, what is the Daisy Field infrastructure project trying to accomplish? Thank you.
Max, do you want to take that, or I can take part?
Why don't you start, Lisa, and then.
Yeah, so I'll answer your first question, Tony, and then I'll have Max take the next one. So as we kind of introduced, there are these three different kind of places for options that we're looking at: before the pipe, in the pipe, and at the end of the pipe. So if you imagine the Muddy River watershed, those before the pipe options are really expanding our green stormwater infrastructure that could be everywhere. So everywhere along the streets of Brookline and Boston, everywhere in folks' backyards. We can think about downspout disconnections and people putting rain gardens on their personal property, as well as utilizing some of our larger park spaces that we do have distributed throughout the watershed. So that might be kind of that nature-based solution, and you can kind of picture it as like sprinkles of greenness everywhere in the watershed. Right? That's kind of a way to imagine it. And then those in-pipe solutions are underground, so they're not nature-based. And then those end-of-pipe solutions, those we are thinking about for ways that we can reimagine how we're using the parkland and the landscape within the Emerald Necklace, because that is a natural place to treat stormwater and these illicit connections that are coming from the larger watershed, and anything that's not being picked up by that you know, before pipe, because a lot of those dry weather issues that we're finding are happening underground or within kind of the pipe network. So they wouldn't necessarily be taken care of by that before pipe solution. So it's really the in pipe and the end of pipe solutions that have the potential to take care of the dry weather pollution that we're seeing. And so, you know, Max used the example of the Alewife wetland as an end of pipe solution. And of course, that is a large landscape, and there isn't too much room within the within the Emerald Necklace, but there are pockets of areas. Max, I don't know if you want to take it and then talk about Daisy too.
Yeah, and Tony, I'll just be like a little bit, maybe a tiny bit provocative in on this call, and you know, just say, you know, I've spent a little bit of time on Leverett Pond in a kayak, and I know that Leverett Pond is home to, you know, a state endangered species, this, you know, freshwater stickleback. But I can also tell you that Leverett Pond is about, you know, 12 inches deep with about 4 feet of muck underneath it. And, you know, the reason it is because that is a landscape feature that's totally out of scale with the inputs that are coming into it. The amount of sediment, the amount of organic loading that's coming into Leverett Pond just completely inundated. And all of that material, instead of being cycled into vegetation, you know, instead of being kind of, you know, locked up in a way that can maintain good water quality, is decomposing in Leverett Pond. You know, my background is as an environmental engineer and in wastewater engineering. And, you know, I would look at that as a, you know, basically a failing, you know, it's a failing retention pond in certain ways. And, you know, I think to look at Leverett Pond and say, how can we design a system that fulfills its habitat goals, but also has the ability to do what it's trying to do, you know, perform sedimentation, process some of these organic inputs. You know, I think there's a real opportunity there. You know, additionally, there's a lot of interesting strategies called stream diversion wetlands, subsurface flow stream diversion wetlands, places elsewhere in the country where, for instance, there are systems that are used to either create in-stream treatment where the water is flowing through a subsurface wetland that provides filtration and bacterial treatment, or even systems where there's a stormwater wetland that's connected to a water body, and pumps might be used to take water out of a contaminated water body, pass it through a natural treatment system, and return it to that water body. So, you know, I think these ideas are a little bit out there. I think they need to be on the table, but, you know, we're at CRWA kind of working on developing them in a responsible way so that we can have an intelligent conversation about them. Yeah, and then I was just going to acknowledge that Charlie Jewell who's a planner at BWSC is on this call. And Charlie, if you, if I do a bad job with this, or if you want to unmute and introduce yourself, please feel free. But the purpose of the Daisy Field Improvement Project, it's a decently large drainage area in Boston. It's an area that has had some illicit connections within it. And this is a system to kind of take an existing urban drainage and divert it into an infiltration system, so that, you know, some portion of the normal flow, you know, after a storm, I think it's not all the way up to a large storm, but, you know, maybe a half-inch storm, is going to be able to soak into the ground and enter the Muddy River much more slowly than it does right now, and not carry with it some of the nutrient bacterial pollution, and certainly not the sediment loads that are coming into it right now.
It's also a major phosphorus control structure.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. So right, it's a big deal for dealing with the phosphorus pollution, which is fueling especially the algal blooms in the Charles River, which some folks have asked about.
Maria, go ahead, and then maybe we'll come to Tim's question in the chat. Go ahead, Maria.
Thank you. Somebody, H. Parker James asked what percentage of the Muddy River water is comprised of stormwater. And Jack answered that, 10% is spring fed from Jamaica Pond. And I think the person that asked the question presumed then that 90% is stormwater. And I just want to clarify that's not really the case. As Max and Lisa and others have indicated, there is a great, I have learned now since working in Brookline only 2 years that Brookline was so named because there were really a lot of brooks that traverse through the valleys of many hills, and these brooks are all culverted now, and they provide a lot of base flow. So even during dry weather, that is what is feeding the Muddy River. And then, of course, when it rains, that flow increases and does, some flushing, but it also flushes in things that we don't wish it to flush in. But I just wanted to clarify that question in the chat.
Thanks, Maria. That's really helpful. There's a question in the chat from Tim Williamson that says, a lot of the discussion is understandably about downstream impacts. What about the headwaters and the water quality issues in Jamaica Pond and the horrible condition of Ward's Pond? Any thought to dealing with water quality issues there?
Yeah, I can take a shot at that. So we do know that there are some springs that come into Jamaica Pond, and there is one small stream that feeds into Jamaica Pond from Sergeant's Pond, a little bit up the hill from Jamaica Pond. So there's definitely opportunities to install those kind of end of pipe solutions around the parkland in Jamaica Pond to reduce the amount of pollution that's coming in there. And I know Jamaica Pond has had some algal blooms in the past few years, which folks might be aware of. And that, as Max said, is really coming from the nutrient pollution, but can also be exacerbated by the bacterial pollution that's coming in. So that's certainly going to be part of our thoughts about options of kind of where to put those. Thank you for highlighting that kind of upper watershed area there.
And yeah, can I tack on, Lisa, just another comment about Ward's Pond and Jamaica Pond? They're really interesting, and in some ways they're kind of different than some of the other components of the Muddy River. Jamaica Pond is a kettle pond, and one of the things that means is that it's a water body that's really, really sensitive. So even with relatively little pollution, it can lead to water quality challenges in the pond. So Jamaica Pond, the magnitude of the inputs and the magnitude of the impairment are different than the Muddy River. And we actually have some really great data that looks kind of as you go from Jamaica Pond all the way out to the Charles River, how does the water quality change? And what you might be surprised to hear actually is that Ward Pond is very, very clean from a bacterial perspective. So a lot of that bacterial stormwater contamination, especially the dry weather contamination, is really all happening downstream of Ward's Pond. We first see it show up as we go downstream of that Daisy Field outlet, and then water quality really degrades as we come downstream of the Village Brook inputs into Levert Pond.
Thanks, Max. I know that we're at time. Is there a final question from anyone? So Arlene, and we've got a few people in the chat. Parker just asked what percentage of Brookline's contribution to the Muddy River water is stormwater. Maybe we'll take that as our last question.
Yeah, go ahead, Max.
Parker's asking a really hard question. What I'm going to say is that Maria is actually kind of in possession of some amazing new studies that the town of Brookline commissioned that are kind of our first chance to really look at that. It's some water flow data that was taken in the Village Brook and the Tannery Brook in the fall to winter of 2023. And they let you really visualize how much of the flow is associated with a storm versus kind of how does that flow return to kind of a base level after the storm. And we're working with Maria to try and understand that information and kind of present it in a way that will make sense for this conversation. So I'll kind of say, stay tuned. But it's a good question, and it's worth really putting the effort in for us to try and explain in a sensible way.
I would just add, that's correct. I mean, I tried to say that there's always a brook and streams flowing in from Brookline into the Muddy River, and those are generally a cleaner flow, unless they're compromised with these illicit connections and discharges. But I don't know that answer offhand. That's a very complicated answer because it really is, when it rains, that's when all the stormwater runoff from all the impervious surfaces are going into our storm drainage system, unless there's a treatment, mini treatments, which there are over 700 in Brookline that we keep track of stormwater best management practices. So some of that water gets intercepted. It would be even with the data that we have, it would be well, maybe we'll be able to tease it out, but it's a very complex question.
It seems like an easy question, but it's not, unfortunately.
Exactly, Max.
All right, Karen, do you wanna add in? And then we'll probably, folks, I know we're past time. If anybody has additional questions and would like to stay on, we're happy to stay on for a few more minutes. But Karen, I'll give you.
Well, I definitely cannot answer the percentage question. I understand that's a very complicated question. This is Karen, president of the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. I'm so glad so many people are there. One of the things that number one, I think Parker's question is a really important one because it tells us how much most of the world probably looks at the river and thinks it's a river. And I mean, it is a river, but maybe doesn't know how much of it is really just street water runoff versus like natural springs or whatever. Because we all have heard there's a natural spring coming out of Jamaica Pond. So it's just kind of interesting to understand that. And maybe there's more ways to communicate about that. But then the other question, I appreciate the idea of trying to use the land of the Emerald Necklace to help clean the water, which is great. And I think that's a wonderful natural system. The challenge, I think, sometimes is that the park system isn't funded to do that. And a lot of times in other cities I've worked in, the water department just starts sort of installing their systems on the parkland, sometimes ends up taking away recreation space or impacting things, and then essentially making the parks department essentially responsible for those things. And we know just how poorly parks departments are funded. So that's always the challenge, right? We want to make sure that we're, balancing all these things. We're not putting obligations on our already underfunded agencies, and that that everything is, I think you guys get what I'm saying, but that's, I think, the challenge when you do want to, there are ways to use these natural systems, but we also do want the parkland to also, provide certain types of amenities, et cetera. So that I'm interested to know more about the Daisy Field project, because I know that a lot of times that's the challenge of how do you balance this new system that maybe will be under a ball field, and then who's going to be responsible for taking care of it? Because Lord knows our parks departments are not funded appropriately. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. So I think at this point, one, I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming out. I really, really appreciate your time and the fact that a lot of you have stayed past 8:07. I think at this stage we can say that we're done. We are, however, available for a few minutes if you have a pressing question you'd like to ask, and we will continue the recording to kind of make that available for anyone who has to drop off. But just wanted to quickly say thank you to everybody who's made it out this evening. No final questions. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. We appreciate your time, and we'll be posting the recording and probably the slides as well on the website. Please feel free to reach out to any of us at CRWA if you have any more questions. Have a good evening.